Well, you're listening to the Crypt here on WRFM, and on the line I have the director of the new documentary feature film My Amityville Horror, Eric Walter. Eric, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Absolutely, it's great to be here.
Thank you so much. Now, this was your first feature documentary. Could you tell us a bit of background about yourself?
Yes, well, I'm an independent filmmaker, originally from Maryland. I live in Los Angeles now, and I've always had, a totally very passionate interest in the paranormal, the unexplained, true crime, and Amityville is kind of a compendium of all of those different things under one roof. And so I was very, very taken by the story at a very young age and became obsessed with kind of discovering what truth lies behind the claims of a haunting. And, of course, there was a mass murder that happened in the house as well. So I became very involved in kind of forming an online archive, as I like to call it, a website called AmityvilleFiles.com, where I basically brought together all of the known information about the case in a kind of a creative presentation, a place where people could go and find an unbiased presentation, perspective on the case, and kind of make up their own minds what they felt happened in that house.
Well, it's a fantastic website, and that's what I like. It's very objective. You can go on and make your own mind up. Do you know, It's not swaying you either way on it, because I know that, like, even now this week when I put up on Facebook that I was going to do this interview, straight away you have the people who believe it and the people who don't, and they were getting in heated discussions about it. So that's what I love about your website. It lets you make your own mind up.
Right, and that's what really kept my interest is the controversy that surrounds it, and also the personalities that surround the story. There definitely is a kind of an interesting, perfect storm of personalities that surround it. And I think probably the main reason the story has had legs like it has so many years.
And then how did it come about then meeting up with Daniel and starting up on this project?
Well, through the Amityville Files website, I was contacted by a contractor, a friend of Daniel Lutz in the Queens, New York area, who claimed that, he was friends with Danny and that Danny had told him about his experiences at length. And I at first was very skeptical and didn't believe, that this was him, until I was sent a photograph, and I knew immediately, because of the striking resemblance that Daniel has to his mother, Kathy, that it had to be, at least this had to be Daniel Lutz. And so I was very, very interested from that point on, and I arranged to fly to New York. I flew to New York in August of 2009 with a digital recorder and about a set of 100 photographs of the house, many of which were black and white images of the investigation that was held in the house on March 6th of 1976. And so I laid these photographs in front of Danny, and, he kind of went to that dark place. You could tell that really brought him back to that moment. And it wasn't an easy process, and if there was anything that I wasn't expecting, it was certainly his intensity and anger, just sheer
that came across a lot
disdain for his stepfather, and the way the whole story had been, he felt, perpetrated by his stepfather, and also the haunting being triggered by him, he felt, through his occult practices. So this was very controversial and definitely a unique perspective on something, kind of the reversal of what has already been told about the story, because George Lutz was the main, voice in the story until his death in 2006.
And he'd also stated he knew nothing about the supernatural prior to this happening to them in the house.
Correct.
So it was interesting, because Christopher's come out and said the same thing as well, that he was practicing the transcendental meditation, and that whatever happened in the house, it was George that triggered it off.
Well, it's interesting to me. It's like, TM is one thing, and I certainly don't think there's any issue with practicing transcendental meditation. However, my theory in listening to those stories, and certainly I wasn't there, but you have to wonder, does a child view that type of activity? George Lutz, seemingly, according to Daniel, introduced Kathy, his mom, to TM and also, other practices. So did the kids view this as something of an occult nature? I don't know if I buy the whole story outright, as in George literally instigated the haunting, because of course that opens all kinds of questions in terms of if that were the case, why did Father Ray, the priest who seemingly blessed the house on the day they moved in, before George had an attempt to do any kind of witchcraft or anything that Danny and Chris are talking about, why did Father Ray claim that he was slapped in the face by some kind of disembodied hand and commanded to get out? So there's things that just don't add up, and that seems to be definitely the case, and certainly removed this 36 years removed from the event now. Our film was very much focused on the traumatic psychological impact that this has had on Danny in particular. And that really is the real tragedy. And as I've been telling people, is for me the real Amityville horror of all of this is that it's now it's left such psychological scars that it's not an easy proposition to tackle.
I think you got that across very well in the documentary, because you can really see the effect this has had on Daniel. And of course, Daniel didn't speak about this for almost 35 years. Why do you think he trusted you to tell his story? Because another person could have taken this and, not given it across the way Daniel wanted it to be put across.
Sure, and I'm sure that's one of his major reasons. I mean, obviously, I'm an independent filmmaker. When I started this project, I was 24 years old. I'm now 28, so it's been quite a bit of time. But, it wasn't really, I don't think, my age or anything had to do with it. It's really the fact that I was willing to listen with an unbiased ear and not try to spin the story. However, I did have many questions, and obviously was not afraid to confront him on what, I was, thinking at the time. But I saved a lot of that for our interview, which, if anybody's seen the film, you can tell, even when I ask him about taking a polygraph test, he really becomes very, very heated. A lot of people have had, a lot to say about that final scene in the film, but I think it leaves it on a point, was this something that, was this a hoax or was it a true horror?
Well, that was it. So, it was a great moment, I think, because you were really left wondering then,
right.
Why doesn't he want to take this test? Is he just insulted, maybe thinking you don't believe him when you asked him to take it? Or, it really left you wondering.
Right.
And he said he'd have words with you afterwards, did he?
Yes, he absolutely did. That's something funny I've been telling people. I mean, certainly he and I are fine now, but in regards to we definitely had, he got in my face after that whole scene.
But I'd say
I think, and like I said, it was definitely, you hit upon it. It was definitely more of, he took it as an assault on his credibility, and not as something. As he wasn't afraid, because he does say in the scene that yes, I would, but he doesn't. He kind of skirts the question, which is interesting.
And also, then it had said that you had approached the other siblings to see would they come on. Did you actually get to speak to them, or were they just point blank? They wanted nothing to do with it.
Well, I spoke to Christopher Coratino at length about being involved in the project. Daniel's sister was not interested at all in being involved in anything Amityville, so that was unfortunate. However, she was 5 years old. While I would love to hear her perspective, she was so young at the time.
Yeah, it'd be very hard to remember.
It definitely would be difficult. So Danny certainly was probably the most reliable in terms of age. I mean, he was the oldest. He was 10 years old, most likely to remember details. However, I found it very interesting that his immediate recollections are so precise that it's very telling sometimes that, is he filling in the gaps in a lot of places, because he can so vividly depict, like where I was standing at a certain time and how I felt.
Yes, that struck me as well. Exactly, he remembers his exact thoughts, and at that age, would you remember your exact thought at the time?
Right, and so I think what I really want people to keep an open mind about when they watch this film is that, it very much represents the blurry line between imagination and reality, and the power of suggestion. Obviously, he's had 36 years to think about these things. And it, for him, in my opinion at least, is very, very real. Do I believe that everything the Lutzes talked about was true? I don't. I think that many things were elaborated upon. but I think primarily by the press and the media, who ran, hog wild with the story after it was, broke in 1976. So, I mean, this was the scene of a mass murder in 1974, and so in the New York area, it was already a place of infamy. So,
sorry,
I'm sorry. It's just there's so much to the story in regards to. I feel that George and Kathy, probably their biggest mistake was, allowing their children's names to be used in the original book. You're forever living in the shadow of something that you can't escape, and I think that that's what our film kind of coincides with or speaks about, is that emotion,
Well, I think, they even said they didn't, when the story broke and Laura got the exclusive on it, they didn't want the kids involved, but then, as you said, their names and all were in the films, so how could they ever hide from this?
Well, they had fictional names used in the films, but the problem is even as Danny talks about, it's kind of one of the most, in my opinion, the more heartbreaking moments that people have noticed in the film is, when he's talking with a therapist about being known as different names in the town that he lives in. So there was immediate, almost identity issues going on there with differentiating yourself between being, Daniel Lutz and Danny Lutz of the...
Yeah, he's really separated himself. Because even the moment where he said, I'm Danny, I'm Daniel's bodyguard. I thought that was quite sad to hear him say something like that. It really, really has such an effect on him. And as one of the therapists said, he's absolutely soaked in suggestion. You go to any website online, you'll get the story of the Amityville Horror. So has he been reading this over the years and, as you said, filled in the gaps? Now, the other day, I listened to an interview Christopher did. And what struck me about that was he did a totally different story to Daniel. And he was saying the whole way through the interview, I'm going to tell my side of the story, and how there was no gunk coming out of keyholes and the windows never broke and there was no flies and everything. And it kind of had me sucked in, but then at the very end of the interview he said, so now I am challenging Hollywood to come forward and I will tell my story in a pay-per-view TV thing. So I thought, well, there you go. You've dragged us along for this interview, sucked us in, and then make a statement like that straight away. People are going to think that's just to make money.
I think that I have a cordial, I guess, relationship with Christopher, and I think that he needs to. Danny, I guess, was lucky in finding someone who was willing to take an unbiased perspective on it and really help him tell his story. Everything that I was able to extract from him, we told, and I didn't leave anything out. So all of it's there for better or for worse. And that was my job as a documentarian. I only hope that Christopher can also, if he is truly, interested in telling his story publicly, doing it in a respectful way. And I think that Chris, is afraid to work with, I guess, the Hollywood system and I don't blame him because of what has already happened, with the subsequent subgenre that's been developed around this. So I in a way, I don't blame him for wanting to do it all himself, but that's all I can really comment on.
I know.
I would think that I do think that their stories do differ. Certainly no one's really ever heard publicly Christopher's entire account of what happened in the house.
No, he never gives it. He only gives it so far and then stops and says he will do it.
I know. It's pretty. Originally, obviously, I wanted to have a compare and contrast, of both of their accounts within film, which would have been fascinating. But there's such heated debate and hard feelings between the family members with Danny himself. I think that this entire project probably is at the dismay of his entire family because, I know that, he's definitely an intense character and it was difficult and many times working with him. So, that's pretty, it's a difficult picture. We were very lucky to kind of get Danny, who hasn't ever spoken publicly, in over 35 years about this, ever been seen publicly or anything. So he really was fresh in that respect.
And it was reliving it for him, as he said himself. Even just to give you a snippet of what happened, he's right back there in his head. So I'd say it was hard for him to do it.
Oh, absolutely.
And of course, it didn't. That went on for 10 hours. You were in that garage. Like, it wasn't over a few days. It was an intense interview, wasn't it?
Yeah, no. I mean, we've shot over several months. You know, documentaries take so much time to produce. However, we that one in particular interview was about 8 hours, and it was really grueling for my crew and everyone. It was really hot in there, but also when I went to New York in 2009 and first met with Daniel, I was recording audio recordings just with a digital recorder as we were talking about it. So many of those tapes you hear within the film were my original conversations with him. So it was kind of an organic process of introducing the audience to Daniel Lutz as a person, and not just jumping to the chase, because I feel there's such a temptation, especially I feel if anyone who wasn't so close to the story, to just run with the haunted house story only and have Danny just confirm everything or deny anything. You know? To me, you
let him tell his story. And then
but also it's a character study. It goes on a deeper level, and I think in many ways transcends the topic of Amityville and talks much more about anyone who goes through an unexplained experience or some kind of traumatic psychological experience in their life as a young child, and how that can manifest in your future and in your adult life.
And were you ever afraid of how far you could go with your questions?
Never afraid, but certainly aware of that I was pushing some buttons, as I mentioned, the whole polygraph test question. When I first met with Danny in 2009, one of the very first questions he asked me was, what was my religion? Yeah. And I had told him at that time, that I was agnostic, and that I did, I wasn't, a follower of, organized religion, but more of an open-minded person, and certainly not close to anything. Anything is possible.
Yeah.
But Danny took, I think, a little bit of took a step back at that point with me, because I think he thought Danny is Roman Catholic, and and I totally respect his position.
Yeah.
I think that he was I guess questioning whether someone of a different religious perspective would be able to understand where he was coming from.
Exactly.
But I think also through the course of making the film, being agnostic is probably the perfect position to have as a documentarian.
Yeah.
Again,
totally objective then.
Yeah, trying to be totally objective with the story. Of course, I have my opinions about it. However, you shouldn't allow your opinions to sway the content of the film.
Well, that's what makes it such a good documentary, is you didn't do that. I thought it was
and I feel like so many pieces about this story have been dragged through the mud, and this has been done so many times, and certainly I don't feel the film is perfect, because I think there's so many things that I would love to go back and try to do again or to get and capture, but I think every filmmaker feels that way. However, I am very proud of what we were able to accomplish, and everything that's in there are the things that Daniel told me, and it was not an easy process. So the scene where Daniel confronts me about my religion and when we're sitting with Lorraine Warren,
when the cross.
He calls someone out, and that was me, the director.
I didn't realise that was you. I was wondering who that was talking in the background.
Right. Well, it doesn't really matter in the context of the film, but the fact that he's addressing people off camera was an interesting kind of breaking the fourth wall moment.
Yeah.
That you only hope as a documentarian happens, within your film. But it was one of those things that it was an interesting moment where I think you really saw. There was almost a moment of hilarity there in a way, because of the roosters and other things that were going on. I know. So
the rooster went off at the worst time I could have made a noise.
Right. Well, and that was not edited that way. That was exactly how it happened, and I couldn't.
But that's the best way to have it natural as it happened, and not be taking the bits out. Leave it as it was. So of course, Daniel hadn't seen Lorraine in all those years, and Laura as well. Those meetings, what were they like for you to be present in those first meetings after all those years?
I mean, as being someone who was an Amityville obsessive, it was awesome. Because, first of all, Laura DiDio, who was a news assistant at the time for Channel 5 News New York, and she was 19 when the story broke, and she broke the story. She was able to get...
She's actually on the show today, Eric, also.
Is she really?
Yeah.
Oh, well, you're talking to the right person.
It's a total Amityville special today on the Crypt.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. Well, she'll have much to say, I'm sure. She was the first person. She was the first person I went to because I knew that she was one of the only kind of unbiased, objective perspectives in the story. Everyone else was, trying to prove that it was a hoax or using the original book as evidence that it was a hoax or trying to prove that it all happened. And I don't think there's any way to do any of that. Yeah. If there was evidence of a hoax, it would have been out by now. Certainly there's much question and I think debate and, common sense comes in and, has to say, are these things possible? So certainly there's a lot of questions that we all have. However, I think Laura's approach to it and really talking to people and looking at the case, she brought in a lot of the original investigators, the Warrens, Hans Holzer. She was responsible for organizing all of those parties that came into it. And Lorraine was someone, obviously, who was, has been removed from Danny's life for quite a bit of time. And, she hasn't seen him since he was a young child. So it was, definitely a touching reunion to be a part of.
Yeah, I thought it was a very emotional moment. But even when he looked into the camera and he said, "This is effing amazing."
Yeah. No, that was one of my favorite moments.
Yeah.
I mean, again, things you hope that happen, but Danny is, there's no denying Danny's theatricality, which I think also is very telling, and he's a good storyteller. There's no denying that.
Oh, totally, definitely.
And so to me, in a lot of ways, it makes you question a lot of the things that are said, because again, of the things he talks about in such exacting detail, I think he's had so much time to think about this, that it does.
He had said he'd had therapy before because of obviously the Amityville Horror. You had him go into therapy sessions in the documentary. Was it hard to get him to do that when it hadn't worked before? Was it easy?
I mean, it was very difficult to get any of that to happen, just because, we're talking about something that, in a lot of ways is a, kind of an unethical thing for someone, a therapist to do. We really didn't look at it. It was more of an interview process, Dr. Susan Bartel, who, is a psychologist, was more interviewing him in that type of session. And so, but Danny has been to therapy for many, many years. But he's always taught, at least what he told me was that, no one ever believed the things that he was saying,
No. And that was another really striking moment, was when he said, "I just wanted someone to believe me." And that was quite emotional.
Right. That was one of my favorite, I think, definitely one of my favorite lines in the film, but also I think...
the look in his eye as well when he said it, do you know?
Yeah, I know. It doesn't, you can see the pain and the hurt and the confusion over what happened. So for me, I don't think there's any way anyone can walk away from this and say that something didn't happen there. Something absolutely...
But that's it. Be it supernatural or not supernatural, these kids' lives were seriously affected. And of course, you had the tragedy of the deaths before it.
Right.
Like Ronnie
DeLeo, and that's exactly what I'm saying. It's something that you can't deny. And it's each affected them in different ways, each of the family members. Another thing
that struck me was when Dr. Susan Bartel, when she started off to question Danny, just as she was starting, he said, now I want to ask you a few questions before we get into this. He wanted to know her most traumatic experience in her life. And I felt that maybe in that moment, Amityville had controlled him all his life, so he wanted to control that situation. He wanted to lead by asking the questions. Do you know? It really came across in that moment when he started asking her.
Right, and that was, I think, again, as I mentioned, like a way to initiate the audience within, with Danny. But he was also, right off the bat, you're seeing how a confrontational and kind of intimidating presence he is. And of course, this is exactly as you said it. I think there's been so many questions over the years. It's like he was ready to challenge everybody on the position. And Danny very much is about, and especially about the topic of the Amityville house and what happened there. He's very, very, steadfast in that, there was a haunting and that this did happen, and don't dare question what I'm saying. He certainly doesn't have problems with people being skeptical, but when you're hands-on first person interviewing him, it's not a comfortable. It can get uncomfortable.
Oh, I'd say definitely there was definitely some intense moments there. Also, I want to ask you, you had loads of clips of him standing outside the house. Was that his first time back to that house, or had he been back before?
He had been back. He talked about. I mean, I don't think he'd been back in a while. He did talk to me about having gone back there in, the early 90s. And, he lives in New York. The rest of his family live in another state out west. So he's kind of removed from everyone else. And he's it's kind of an interesting, perception or perspective, just that in and of itself. But, yeah, he had been back to the house, and he had talked about going back, with his brother one time in the early 90s. And so I know that they've each been back certain times. I know George Lutz claimed that he never, ever wanted to go back to the house and had told, friends of his not to go there and was afraid. I mean, according to Laura DiDio, she had claimed as well that George refused to go on and even walk onto the property when he was handing over the keys for them to her and the Warrens to go in and investigate. Yeah. Right. They were he wouldn't even meet them at the house. So,
and of course that night we got the ghost boy picture. What's your theories on that?
It's an interesting photograph, and so many people when they see that, go, they gasp and, this, there has to be something to this, and it is an unsettling photograph. There's no denying that.
Especially the eyes.
I tend to be a skeptic in terms of its validity. Was this a spirit or some kind of entity in the house? Certainly while I think it's a creepy image, I think if you look at it closely, it looks like a man kneeling down, looking around the corner, wearing eyeglasses with a reflection of a burst of light in the eyeglass. So there was a gentleman there, an assistant to the Warrens named Paul Bartz, who was someone who was there and was in the house at the time, and there were hundreds of this photographs of the second floor bedroom. The camera was set up on a timer on a tripod and was taking hundreds of photographs that night. And this gentleman was wearing what appears to be a flannel shirt. In that photograph, he was wearing this guy had mentioned, Paul Bartz, was wearing a flannel shirt, as well as wearing I don't know if he was wearing eyeglasses or not. However, it looks like he's wearing glasses in the photograph. But it is a mysterious photograph. The hair and everything else, the resemblance to that person, is too great to me to dismiss. And I think, what's more likely here?
Yeah, exactly. Well, so that's a part of the story I didn't know now. It was about that man in the house also.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Then, going back to George, Daniel says in the documentary how, when his biological father left, how that was his world and they were a happy family in his eyes, and when his father left he didn't know where he fitted in anymore, and that made him grow closer to his mother. So obviously George comes along and the mother falls in love with him, and that would probably strike up some bitterness there before any of the abuse and stuff that Daniel talks about would have started. He would be bitter at this man taking his mother away. And then also, of course, he's a lot of emotional scars. He said he was in an abusive relationship. He's tried to kill George, he said before. A question I would have, which I would wonder, is with the abusive childhood he said he had at the hands of George, would he be maybe replacing those memories with the memories of all these Amityville stories to try and maybe block out what had gone on in that house?
I fully you. Yes, and it's to me, I've told many people, what seems very apparent in Danny's approach to telling you this story is that his memory of the haunting seems to be one in one, hand in hand with his memory of his stepfather. Yeah. In many ways, I think that George Lutz represents the Amityville Horror for Daniel.
Yeah.
And in so many ways, I think you're very right about, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of him replacing, blocking out, that memory. I certainly think that there's almost the memory of George and his anger and disdain for the person almost, overshadows the entire account.
Yeah.
And I think that his emotional reaction to that is very unguarded, and I think is very apparent to anybody who's obviously listening to the story.
Yeah.
But people will take it different ways. I mean, for me, I took it as though, his natural father was removed from the picture.
Yeah.
Replaced by a militaristic, ex-Marine, by all accounts, a very domineering personality for everyone I was able to talk to who knew George at the time. And so this person was able to, come into his life, and, very soon afterwards they moved into 112 Ocean Avenue. So I could see how a 10-year-old would piece together, these things happening. As soon as you came into my life, all of this happened.
Yeah,
again, that's a theory, but I can see that kind of emotional reaction being attributed to that. And so that is very key, I think, and very telling. And I think Danny's anger towards George colors a lot of his statements about him, especially with many of the claims of, practicing telekinesis at will and dabbling in the occult. I mean, these extreme examples, I think, are just very telling of Danny's character. And again, the blocks and the mental blocks he's put on it to deal with and to be able to blame someone. Those are my theories. Certainly none of us were there, and we'll never be able to prove, but it seems like the story gets further and further away from and more, lurid as it goes on. More and more paranormal, phenomena seems to be interjected. I mean, it's one thing to say that there were spirits in the house that, were violently assaulting the family, but to claim that, prior to moving into the house, that your stepfather was able to, manipulate objects with his mind, is a whole nother conversation. So again, I think for people, I mean, it's one of those things that I don't look at it as literally as, as that. I think that Danny does need someone to blame, and this is his way of doing that.
Well, I think that's what is consistent in Daniel and Christopher's stories, is both of them have a powerful hatred for George. Whatever went on in that house, that is what's consistent in both of them. And as you say, whether something supernatural went on or not, there's no denying what these poor kids, what it's done to their lives, But, well, listen, Eric, thank you so much. To anybody who wants to get their hands on My Amityville Horror, where is it available?
It is available from IFC Films currently, and it's available on iTunes and Amazon Instant Download. It's available in Comcast, Time Warner, the VOD markets. The DVD is coming out in August, as well as all of our foreign. There's been a lot of questions about when is it coming out, overseas, and as well as Canada. We're working on deals right now, so there's some news coming out very soon about that. So stay tuned to our Facebook page, My Amityville Horror, or our website, which is www.amityvillemovie.com.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Eric. I know loads of people have been asking how they can get hold of it, because, of course, it's been on the go. It premiered last summer, wasn't it, at one of the film festivals, Fantasia Film Festival. So I know a lot of people are really looking forward to seeing it. It's a great documentary. And
all right, I promise it's on the way.
Perfect. Well, Eric, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure.